Our speaker is Enrique Armijo, who is a new, I guess brand new?
Brand spanking new.
Oh, brand spanking new professor of law at Elon University. And he teaches in the areas of media, communications, internet law and policy, torts, and international freedom of expression. Before he was at Elon, he was at the firm of Covington Burling in Washington, D.C., and he advised journalists and news organizations on media-related issues. He worked on some famous appellate court cases, including FCC v. Fox television stations, which is a big broadcast indecency case. He has published in a variety of law reviews. He's been a visiting scholar at the Program for Comparative Media Law and Policy at the University of Oxford's Center for Socio-Legal Studies. That's a mouthful. Worked on media law projects around the world. I think he's going to talk about Rwanda today. Clerked at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Was a legal clerk for Brooks Pierce in Raleigh, and that's Wade Hargrove's firm. And some of our former students practice law there, so we feel like he's our friend. He also has a master's degree from UNC, graduated from the law school here, and while he was at the law school here, he was editor-in-chief of the North Carolina Law Review, which is a real big deal. Don't you think?
Seemed so at the time.
You're not so sure. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks, Kathy. And thank you for the invitation. Obviously, I have a deep connection and fondness for Chapel Hill, and my wife is also an alum of this school. So it's really great to be here. As Kathy said, I teach media and communications law at Elon. I also teach torts and worked on some copyright, privacy, defamation, other media law issues while I was in practice. And my research at the law school focuses on international freedom of expression, the First Amendment, and what I'm going to talk about today, which is digital free speech. Sorry, I can't get it up here. Yeah. Sorry, we had some...
Well, let me ask you this first. Is it true that Michael Hopkins was the TA in your law class?
That is true. I had Sandra Chance for media law at Florida.
Dr. Hopkins was the TA.
Yep, and he was a TA. Yeah, I look forward to reintroducing myself to him as if he would know who I was. I think that class had about three.
Knowing him, he probably remember your grades.
Yeah, I think that class had about 150 people in it. Well, anyway, this research is trying to figure out what's different about digital speech and whether or not those differences should affect how we think about it, how we regulate it, how we advocate for it, and how we protect it. And it's also a question that requires us to think through this on the international side and on the domestic side, both for the obvious reasons digital communications challenge a lot of our legal notions of sovereignty and jurisdiction. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it also affects how we should think about advocacy for freedom of expression in other countries, which, as Kathy said, I'll talk about near the end. So I'm going to start with two quotes that I think really express some of the tensions that I think about when I try to think through this issue. The first one is from Larry Diamond, who is a very famous and very prominent sociologist, political scientist, and you see there ICT is an abbreviation I'll be using throughout. But the idea of communication technology is liberation technology that enables citizens to engage their government and to challenge their government and to talk to each other in ways that they couldn't before. A tool that gives individuals the right to self-determination. And what I've been calling this is basically Twitter as samizdat. Samizdat were the publications that were passed around in the Soviet bloc. Publishing this material was illegal because of strict censorship rules there, so people self-published pro-democracy tracts and passed them around from hand to hand. So small publishing, micro-publishing is an instrument for democratic change, something that is really shaping, it's not an exaggeration to say, our academic agendas and our political agendas. in terms of the public policy of the Department of State and of other parts of the government. And the flip side of this utopia is represented in a quote by Sergey Brin, who's one of the co-founders of Google, who said he thought there was no way to put the genie back in the bottle, but now it seems in certain ways the genie's being put back in. And I would argue that this is a more realistic frame for what's actually happening as to the role of ICT in free speech. And the main reason for that is because digital speech is a completely intermediated experience. This is how a simple model of how U.S. law deals with communication between citizens in physical space. The S is the speaker, the L are the listeners, and the arrows are the speech. So this way of analyzing and thinking about communications problems has a couple of presumptions in it. One, and the most important one for these purposes, is that the speakers and the listeners share the same physical space. So we have a geographical limitation on communication between individuals. In addition to that, there's also a temporal limitation, which means that the speaker and the listener generally have to be in the same place at the same time. Now, when there's an alleged government interference with speech, what do? Courts and lawyers look at the space. This is what's known as our public forum doctrine in First Amendment law. If the space is a traditional speech space, it's much harder for the government to close that space off to speakers without offending the First Amendment. And to just take a quick diversion into property law, which I apologize for in advance, this concept is based on the principle of easements. And an easement is a right, an earned right to use of property that you earn over someone else's property. And when the court started to think about this problem, what they decided was that the government has granted certain speech easements to speakers. If you have a space that's been traditionally open for speaking, it's been used for that reason, for example, a park, then the government must meet a very high obligation in order to close that speech off to future speakers. So this model is the way to think about ICT-enabled communication. It's on a citizen-to-citizen basis. There you have the same speakers and the same listeners, but they don't share the same physical space. Space is sent and received from different locations, and space remains received for as long as a device can keep it. You don't have to share the space at the same time either. But what this model also shows is the nature of digital speech as an intermediated experience. And what that means is that at every point of the communication process, at the time the speaker speaks, at the time the speech is sent, and at the time listeners receive the speech, all of that activity is facilitated by a third party. In the case, this could be a network, this could be a piece of software like Twitter or Facebook or BlackBerry Messenger. So at every point we have third parties facilitating the communication. So what we've been able to get away from is limitations based on space and time, but what we've sacrificed to get that is this system of intermediated speech. So what this also means is that at every point of intermediation, we've created an opportunity for private parties, or in my interest, the government, to interfere with speech. So what kind of interferences are we talking about? We've got interferences ex ante, i.e. interferences before the speech takes place, and interferences ex post, which are interferences with speech after it occurs. So what intermediation of speech has permitted? It's created, multiply the opportunities for ex ante interferences to occur, but it's also made ex post interferences much more efficient. On the ex ante side, we have kill switches, and I'll talk about those in a second. What I'm talking about there is essentially shutting off access to communications networks. blocking of individual websites, social media software or content. That's India blocking Facebook and Twitter. Iran blocking similar services in 2009. Pakistan eliminating access to services during Eid. Licensing, media laws being amended, existing media laws being amended to require the licensing of websites, which is a very common occurrence. Commercial restraints, that's countries that actually prohibit the ownership, private ownership of modems. We see that in Myanmar and Cuba. And then substitutes. This is you may have heard about the Iranian internet, which is an effort by the Iranian government to basically build its own internet and to keep its people off. And then on the ex post side, the first and most obvious one is surveillance. I don't talk a lot about surveillance, but it's important to keep in mind how surveillance affects collective action. I think if you look at sociological work, it will show you that if a group seeking to organize is either being observed or has fear of being observed, it has to change the focus of its organization from pursuing its goal to defensive postures. So what we have here is surveillance being so effective that it goes from an ex post interference to an ex ante interference. And then countermeasures, and this is most common in China, where we see government employees in chat rooms and those kinds of countermeasures. So in terms of ex ante interferences, one very prominent, and it's something a lot of people are thinking about, I know David's thinking about this at the law school, are private party speech intermediaries in the communication space. And you hear this sometimes referred to as terms of service as speech rules. You have Google's decision to take down the Innocence of Muslims video. You have Twitter selectively deciding to ban certain accounts in certain countries based on its interpretation or based on information it receives from governments in those countries. And then this also relates to debates over net neutrality in the sense of whether or not the government should force networks to non-discriminate in terms of the information that goes out over a network. So the question here for a lot of people is whether or not these private companies need to be more transparent in the way they make blocking decisions or filtering decisions. Basically trying to impose something like judicial decision making, which is here's what we did and here's why we did it and here's how we may handle this in a future case, onto companies like Google and Twitter and Facebook. I'm more focused on government interferences with speech, but one thing to keep in mind is the possibility for collusion between private parties and governments in terms of requiring private companies to make their networks more surveillable, more easily shut off as a condition of network construction, as a condition of operation in a certain country or a certain part of the world. So one example of an ex ante speech interference here in the United States. In 2011, a protest was planned on the San Francisco subway system, the BART, in response to a police shooting there. BART had cell phone service repeaters that permitted people to have cell phone service inside the trains and on the platforms. When they heard about this protest, they decided to shut these off. There was a strong reaction to this, a strong negative reaction. There was a hashtag on Twitter that was MoveBarTech, which I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, and about how this was an offense to the free speech of the people who were riding the trains. The California State Senate passed a bill saying that you had to have a court order basically to shut off service. Governor Brown vetoed that bill, an interesting decision on his part. And the BART position, you can imagine, they say that if we receive knowledge of a device that is going to be detonated in the subway, we have to be able to shut off cell phone service if we learn that that device is going to be detonated via cell phone. A reasonable position. They also say that trains are for riding from place to place, and platforms are to get people on trains. They are not for speech, which is essentially an argument based on our old model of face-to-face communication, right? So under current law, BART's argument is that the speech space is a government space, it's a train platform, it's not a place where speech traditionally occurs, Therefore, this isn't a close case. We can shut off these repeaters, and the First Amendment should not be at all concerned. However, you have to remember that the government is not just providing the speech space, it's also the intermediary for the speech because it has control over the network. Here's our second model. Even if you concede the fact that the speaker is on a train platform, on government speech, it's not at all clear, A, that the speaking would take place in the train station, or it's certainly not the case that the people who receive the speech would be in the train station. So what does that mean for this model of public forum communication that we have? Does it fit to problems involving speech that is carried over ICT? This is one of the things that I am trying to figure out, whether or not there's another way to look at this problem. If you have any ideas, I'm happy to hear them. And this is going to come up in a variety of contexts. Most prevalently in municipal Wi-Fi. You have New York used 12,000 of its old phone booths to provide Wi-Fi service. Cities of all sizes, even High Point, the article on the right, is talking about providing or has plans to provide municipal Wi-Fi service in partnership with private companies. So in some of these cases, the governmental entity is the operator of the network. In other cases, you have a government-private partnership, and then the issue there will be whether or not the private party should be covered by the First Amendment because it's essentially acting like a state actor. So as more and more of our speech becomes intermediated, you see that this becomes more and more of an issue. So as the BART example shows, control over the network is control over the speech. This is data from Google Analytics, and it shows the use of Google in Egypt and Libya during the uprisings there. The way that this was taken out, the way this was done by the governments is a little bit different. It involves control over routers. In Egypt, there were basically 5 ISPs. In Libya, there was 1. But you see there a stark illustration of what happens when a government has control over the communications network. And these are the 2 most prominent shutdowns that we know about there, but there have been others in Syria and Burma, selective regions in parts of China where internet service has been shut down. An example of something that can occur because we're talking about intermediated speech driven by communications technology. And this is an issue here in the States, particularly in our ongoing debate about free speech versus security, which manifests itself in a range of ways. This is a part of a bill that was offered by Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins that involved protecting cyberspace. There you see the name of the legislation. And Senator Lieberman had a lot of pushback on this particular provision of the bill, and in this clip you'll see him trying to defend it.
Sunday morning, 90s. You had an internet bill. It's been called the Kill Switch bill that would allow the president to seize control or shut down portions of the internet if the U.S. was under some sort of cyber attack. I don't know if you've seen the internet lately. There's a lot of people out there who think that what you are granting the president is absolute power to shut down freedom of speech. I mean, this is just over the top.
No way. And total misinformation. I don't know whether people are intentionally peddling misinformation. Here's the fact. Cyber war is going on in some sense right now. Our civilian infrastructure, the internet that runs the electric grid, the telecommunications grid, transportation, all the rest is constantly being probed by nation states, by some terrorist groups, by organized criminal gangs. And we need this capacity in a time of war. We need the capacity for the president to say, internet service provider. We've got to disconnect the American internet from all traffic coming in from another foreign country. Or we've got to put a patch on this part of it. The president will never take over, the government should never take over the internet. And listen, we've consulted, Senator Collins and I are proposing this bill with civil liberties and privacy experts. This is a matter of national security. A cyber attack on America can do as much or more damage today by incapacitating our banks, our communications, our finance, our transportation as a conventional war attack. And the president, in catastrophic cases, not going to do it every day, not going to take it over. So I say to my friends on the internet, relax. Take a look at the bill. And this is something that we need to protect our country. Right now, China, the government, can disconnect parts of its internet in the case of war. We need to have that.
The part of that cut out was Senator Lieberman saying we need to be able to do that too. So you had, you had this bill in the Congress, and this is the first version of it. And after Senator Lieberman and others tried to defend it, and again, the timing was unfortunate based on the what was going on in Egypt at the time. But here's the second version of the same bill. You see that Senator Lieberman basically lost this argument. And also note, too, the change in the name of the legislation. But this is an ongoing debate. I mean, and you all are familiar with the tension between free speech and security. This is just one example of how it manifests itself in the context of cybersecurity. Now we turn to ex post speech interferences. And a lot of literature here, as I referred to at the beginning with the Larry Diamond quote, involves smart mobs, what I and others call smart mobs, as engines of collective action. And what that means is that people, as Howard Rheingold said, a group of people who don't know each other, but if they have a common cause or a common desire, they can act in concert almost immediately. And then you have Reed's Law, a famous article in the Harvard Business Review talking a little bit about why this happens from a mathematical perspective. But what you have here is this same kind of pain to the efficacy of this technology is also used as a justification to take steps in the exercise of the police power that haven't been taken before. And this is a clip from Good Morning America that talks a little bit about this. Sorry about this. Excuse me, I didn't know this. I didn't know we were going to have to watch a political ad, which I'm sure you all had your fill of. Yeah.
Are you logged in YouTube?
Sorry?
If you're not logged in, you get more.
Oh. I'm not logged in. This does not constitute an endorsement.
Disturbing and dangerous new trend, flash robberies or flash robs. It's when a group of young thieves, often making plans to steal via social media, plot to converge on a store and ransack it, taking everything. And our weekend anchor Dan Harris has been looking at this.
Hey, Robin, good morning. This poses a serious challenge to retail stores all over the country. It's tough enough to deal with one thief. How do you deal with a whole mob of thieves?
What's immediately striking from this surveillance video of a flash mob robbery of a convenience store near Las Vegas is how casual and carefree the thieves appear to be, as if breaking the law as part of a crowd gives them extra confidence. Check out this kid in the hat smirking as he waits for his friends to leave so he can get in. Or the young woman in the white hoodie calmly loading up on booze.
As you saw in their faces, they thought it was pretty funny, but we sure don't.
You see a shockingly similar attitude in the body language of these 20-odd thieves swarming a clothing store in Washington, D.C. They took their time, apparently looking for items in their size. YouTube is loaded with these so-called flash rob videos from around the country. These things can easily turn violent as the mob mentality takes hold. In this robbery at a gas station in St. Paul, Minnesota, you can see one of the kids assaulting the clerk on his way out.
By the time that our officers got there, they were able to corral about 24 of them, but a number of other kids also did get away.
Police say the best things for clerks to do is simply stand back, just like the employee here in Las Vegas.
He did exactly what he was supposed to do. He tried to remain calm.
Reportedly, there was a recent spate of these flash robs in Chicago, including 4 in a 10-minute span. The good news here is since these robberies are often caught on surveillance cameras, it makes busting thieves very, very easy.
I was going to say that. That's posed for the camera right there.
Exactly. I think a lot of these kids like being on camera.
Seems that way, Dan. Thanks.
So what do you do if you are on the city council, for example, in the city of Cleveland, and you have knowledge of an impending crime being committed by a group of people, and you have no idea how large that group is? Well, you try to pass an ordinance that makes this illegal. This ordinance was vetoed by the mayor. But I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of these efforts to take ex post measures to punish what is essentially speech. And what is the problem with this? Then the criminal law has to do what it often does. It's going to have to make judgments about what is punishable. Is a tweet that says, "Let's go rob the 7-Eleven on Franklin Street," punishable by the state police power? Maybe. What about a tweet in response that says, "Yeah, let's go"?
It's criminal conspiracy, probably not.
This implicates the law of conspiracy. But it also implicates punishing speech. So this is something that we have to think about. And as someone who doesn't actually take part, this goes directly to conspiracy. What is someone who doesn't necessarily take part in the event, but who gives a tweet or speech in support of it? Does that rise to the level of aiding and abetting? I don't know that we're sure. Now that's an ex ante interference, but what about an ex post interference? Here you see a bit of a more aggressive posture on the same problem.
Disturbing and dangerous new trend. Flash robberies or flash
Sorry.
robs. It's when a group of young thieves, often making plans to steal via social media.
Sorry about that. Well, we may not get this one, but this was an example of David Cameron, who stood up in the Parliament in the UK after there were riots there that were organized by BlackBerry Messenger. And he said that we're going to have to consider taking measures about whether or not we can permit these people to use this type of communication. There you have a tradition that's probably less protective of speech than ours, but you have an example of an ex ante interference with speech as a way to try to fight crime. And here you have recognizing interferences with speech via communications technology as a human rights violation. This is an executive order signed by the president in April that basically bans certain entities, and in one case a company, from entering the United States and freezing assets in the United States because of those entities' interference with communication by Syrians and Iranians in those countries. Secretary of State Clinton also gave a speech about internet freedom. She's given it a couple times now. So as we see that this becomes the policy of this country, we'll see how these problems continue to manifest themselves. So how does this inform scholarship? How does it inform advocacy? In 2007, I was on a team that sought to help the Rwandan government to rewrite its media laws. It was the first time that the media laws had been rewritten after the genocide. This clip, which I'm unable to play, was a clip from a radio station called RTLM, at which Hutus would say on the radio that it was time to exterminate cockroaches. and the cockroach was a term used to describe Tutsis. And you had on this radio station DJs singing songs about exterminating cockroaches, giving out addresses where Tutsis were hiding, basically facilitating genocide. And the United States Embassy wanted to help Rwanda become more eligible for Millennium Challenge funds. One of the indicators there is rule of law. One of the sub-indicators there is freedom of speech. So let's help Rwanda get a more robust protection for freedom of expression. But this was in the context of everything that had happened before, and it's important to remember that media law is not just law, it's also a narrative text about a society. It speaks to how the country defines itself, what the country aspires to be, and how the country has responded to crisis. And on the latter point, there was law, both in the Rwandan Penal Code and in the media law, that stated referring to someone as a Rwandan in most context, referring to someone as a Hutu or a Tutsi was an act of divisionism that was punishable by the law. And then newspapers, this is a newspaper called Kangura, which published a number of articles emphasizing the racial superiority of Hutus over Tutsis. This issue said, quote, "Which arms could we destroy the cockroaches for good?" That is obviously a picture of a machete, which, as you might know, was the primary tool used by genociders in Rwanda. So when you have this backdrop, and when you have 40% mobile phone penetration in Rwanda, internet penetration is still a little bit low. It's about 7%. So what do you do when you're thinking about these legal regimes, when you're trying to work on the legal regimes? Where do you put all this information? If you're an advocate, not everybody has to be an advocate, but if you are, how do you try to think through these issues? Well, this is just a framework that I've been thinking about, and it's filled with caveats and presumptions. And it doesn't fit any example, let alone most examples, but it's just a starting point. If you have a country where development is low, and you might mean economic development, you might mean development of communications infrastructure, you might mean protection of freedom of expression, and if you have what you determine to be a high capacity for intermediation, and that can mean that could mean no communications networks, that could mean no private actors operating in the communication space. It could mean a government that's very interested and very involved in the development of the communications sector. What should our presumption be? Well, one presumption that I've applied is to try to keep the internet away from the regulation of traditional media. Because what you'll find in most of these countries is a regulation of media that's very focused on content-related prescriptions. Of course, some of those are also in the penal code, so this is a bit of a challenge, obviously. You have strict licensing requirements, the licensing of newspapers, capitalization requirements, where if you want to start a television station or radio station, you have to have some ungodly sum of money that no one would be able to come up with when applying for a license. So the better course, the better starting point at least, is to start out by presuming that the internet is essentially unregulated and untouched by these legacy media systems, and then try to work from there. But as I said, every country is different, and we have to deal with what's possible as well as what's ideal. So those are the comments I had, and I'm happy to hear any comments or questions if you have any.
I have one. Going back to your model with the speakers and the listeners, you presumably, too, one of the sort of added layers here, right, is the degree of cooperation amongst the listeners in the speech going back and forth between the listeners. This is sort of a key point, that you could be drawing lines, right, from L1 to L2, and L1 to L3, and L1 to L4.
Right.
So there's that interpersonal communication that previously was, I mean, unless there was a crime involved,
Right.
more or less unregulated.
Right. Yeah.
So seems to me that that's, you know, one of the things that really contributes quite excitingly in many ways to what our information environment looks like right now, and is presumably what's so exciting about, you know, what's going on in places like Egypt, or at least initially.
Right. And problematic as well, but I just drew in the arrows in my model as you're talking. But because what you can have if you have speech going across the L1 parts of the model, that's absolutely true. You can also have liability running back to the S in some cases.
Yes, right. So, and I'm sure there are plenty of communication theorists in the room. I'm sure there are models that mirror this, but I like the connection to the legal realm in this.
So I'm trying to remember how BlackBerry messaging works, because I believe it does do the L1 to L2 to L3 kind of thing without going back to the source, and that's why it was the preferred texting of choice at the London Rise, because you couldn't shut it down easily.
Right.
Whereas you could, if it were, say, AIM, which uses a central server,
right,
then you can make that server liable. But in the BlackBerry case, assuming they're using the near messaging service, then you're doing strictly peer-to-peer with no intermediary.
Right.
Which is impossible to regulate, really.
Right.
And you should check me on that, but I'm pretty sure that that's why they chose, why that was more popular. And it's also cheap.
Right.
Whereas BlackBerries in the U.S. are defined, socially defined as soup machines.
Right.
In the UK, they're basically a free text machine.
Right.
So,
what kind of machine did you say?
For suits.
For suits?
Yeah, the only reason in the U.S. anybody has a BlackBerry is because they're boss bought. Whereas in the UK, the charges for messaging are differentiated. So get out but make sure I'm not just making this up.
No, that's a great point. I think that's right.
If I remember, that was why it was such a good buy. In England, the riders really like it.
Right.
I'm also curious as to how much the smart Rob thing is a moral panic effect, and how much of it is actually supported by anything other than two looping cameras, which is what we saw.
Right.
Because one of the instances you have is, of course, when you make law, is a strong reaction from moral panic. And
exactly.
that, not just the UK definition, again, the idea of the mods versus rockers, where that term came out, but in the sort of US version.
Right, that's exactly right. Exercise of police power based on what could happen,
right, and
not what in fact did happen.
Actually creates an environment in which it can, a theater in which it can be more.
Right,
right. Which could be.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm in a slightly more abstract theory, that's saying that moral panic of all sorts. As I can't remember the guys who wrote the big UK book on it, but it's the Mods versus Rockers thing. He had basically a Marxist interpretation. In the U.S., it was almost immediately depoliticized, but there it was. So you need more police, so what happens is the rhetoric actually creates an environment in which you actually need more police, and then it kind of builds up like that.
Right, and these, as Kathy said, these Cleveland City Council people were certainly pointing to YouTube videos of what occurred in Philadelphia. And right, exactly.
And well, I mean, even at that, that's one of the famous things. You have something happen, that relates to what people are afraid of already, and then you have a moral entrepreneur ready to take advantage of that instance. Internet addiction, for example, the biggest authority on that is the person who's also published in those books.
Right.
You know, and for your model, the law usually assumes, right, that the system infrastructures are constant.
Right.
You know, we're all using this. And here's, we've got these infrastructures that work.
Right.
Yes, some are mediated, some are disintermediated, some use a central repeater, some don't. In the case of the BART stuff, there's a lot of involvement from 4chan community.
Right.
awfully hard for law to address that.
Right.
You know, in a you know, serious or consistent regulatory way.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, and the BART people used the UK subway bombings as an excuse.
Right.
To do the same.
Yeah, and that excuse is difficult, I think, to respond to.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's obviously if you were a strict Rushnar security person,
right.
Why would you ever do that?
Right. Yeah, and that's.
But if you were an elected official, you're going, what does it cost me to do that?
Yeah, and the way the incentives work is either have repeaters that I can shut off or not have repeaters at all.
Right, and the customers demand it.
Right.
They're going to have that.
Right.
Okay, that's one of the big promises for long.
Right. Right.
Can you go over that again? The speaker, level one, speaker and listener, they're in the same space, and then 2, 3, 4. What are they?
These are different listeners. You know, the way to think about this is Hyde Park.
I mean, what was listener 2?
Just a different person.
Different person.
Yeah, this is
The broadcast model.
Yeah, this is what public forum doctrine is based on, and this is Hyde Park. This is a person standing on speaker's corner and talking to a group of people. And what this tries to demonstrate is it doesn't really matter if that speaker is standing on speaker's corner or not. But the law still worries about the space that he is in when it determines whether or not L1, L2, L3, and L4 are able to receive speech.
So the legal doctrine is based on space.
And one of the issues that comes up in all that I read about is that, you know, you're most protected in your speech activities in traditional public forums, but the way they're defined, maybe we can never have another traditional public forum because they have to be historically public places. So the internet isn't an historically public place because it's not old enough. You know, so it's kind of that issue of how would something qualify, something new qualify as as a traditional public forum.
Under current law, these cases are easy for exactly that reason. I mean, the American Library Association brought a case about, you know, what you could and couldn't do, look at on a library terminal. And the Supreme Court said, in an opinion by Justice Rehnquist, exactly what Kathy just said. It's not a traditional public forum, therefore the library can do whatever it wants. Or Congress can tell the library that as a condition of receiving federal funds to run the library, Congress can say basically whatever it wants. And that's the kind of, that gets at it as much as any model as the idea of a traditional public forum.
So in Boston Common, you're fine, but
right.
beyond that.
Right.
Yeah, so you have, so something that's slightly over third spaces, you know, things that are not public nor private, quite public accommodations.
Right.
For example, bar, a coffee shop, in the Habermasian, the transfer. So that's really the space we're kind of talking about. So I don't know much about law in that area. So, I mean, obviously you cannot have solicitors at the mall. You can create some kind of space against that. But there are other places which are sort of hold themselves out as places of free exchange. And how does that work out? Just in meat space, not necessarily the communications.
Right. Well, I've been thinking a lot about airport terminals.
Yeah, that would be a good one if you're a half-Frisian.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's where the most of the stuff comes from.
And it's true that
those guys have most of the case history.
Yeah, it's true that the general rule is private space, right to exclude.
Private things.
Yeah.
An airport terminal, certain public accommodation.
Yeah, and you all may teach some First Amendment cases that involve, you know, newspaper kiosks in airports.
Right, because of the newspaper.
Yeah.
Or outside a grocery store. If
Yeah.
you do it as they say on Food Line, then Food Line removes all your newspaper things. That
Right.
actually happens.
Right.
That's and I think the Harris Teeter won on that.
Right. Oh yeah.
Or how far they went before. But
Yeah, I have a
there
cop.
are any independents outside of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question, I guess, about the cell phone repeaters. I'm really interested in this, and so I'm kind of wondering if you know how, if at all, other cities have responded to the BART incident, kind of what other cities' policies are with cell phone repeaters. It seems like that's an issue that they should have considered
Yeah, that's a good question that I should start to keep track of, but I haven't. But I mean,
I'm just wondering if it set off something.
It seems.
I haven't heard anything about the BART incident since that happened. I mean,
Yeah.
I've heard a lot about it for a month or two, and then nothing.
And then, yeah.
Nor have I heard about anyone deciding not. I mean, it's kind of like if people want cell phone service on the train, they're going to get cell phone service on the train. Yeah.
Yeah, there's too much consumer.
Yeah. So maybe this, maybe this is, this is a big problem in an academic sense, but in a practical sense, you're going to have it and you're going to be able to turn it off. But I agree with you. I haven't heard anyone saying that in light of, what happened on the BART and other than this bill that was in the California State Senate that didn't really go anywhere. And to have to get a court order before you turn the stuff off, that's as good as nothing if you're BART. I mean, you say, we have to be able to do this in 5 minutes. Yeah. When I started working on this, my wife, started talking to my wife about it, she said, so are you going to be the NRA of Twitter? And I don't, that's the hard question in response. If you want to recognize a robust communications right over technology, you have to be able to. I mean, that is the primary counter argument that you're going to receive again and again. If I were to go to somebody who's running a network, a Wi-Fi network, and talk to them about this stuff, they're going to say, I hear what you're saying, go back to campus, and I'm going to have an on-off switch. Or my director of public safety is going to have one because we have to deal with the practical.
So I'm interested in what you've observed in developing countries, since it sounds like you pay attention to that. Clearly the lessons of the last few years have been, from China and from Arab Spring, is that there's a lot the government can do to control the internet.
Right.
It's not that hard. So is that what you're seeing? Is there evidence of that countries that are just dealing with this or in the early stages are learning those lessons and trying to control internet communication more tightly?
Yeah. Well, it's really a case-by-case question. I mean, in the Middle East, you have, and I think have talked to people from there and been there enough to know that you will always have strict content-based regulation. I mean, the defamation of religion will always be a crime that is punishable by prison or worse in every country in the Middle East. And the reason for that is I had someone in Jordan say, well, in this country, the president is to the left of the parliament and the parliament is to the left of the people. So there's no public, and you see it when the way people react to things, the way that a small minority of people reacted to the Innocence of Muslims video. I mean, there's not any political will to have a robust protection of content the way that we have it here. But on the internet side, like I said, I mean, my kind of ambition is when I read a draft statute, a draft broadcasting statute from a different country, I say, it looks like you intended to leave the internet out. I think that's a good idea. But you have a lot of the same kind of motivations as you have here: protection of children, public order, national security. All of that is it's run through regulation of traditional media, and it's going to run through any attempted regulation of online communication as well.
I've observed that in some other countries, we have such high tolerance for what's in the media because we're so used to it.
Right.
We don't like it, but we don't burn anything down.
Yeah.
And we're used to the things, reading bad things about our political leaders.
Yeah.
And it's okay, and they're okay. They don't like it either, but they don't put anybody in jail for saying that they lie.
Yeah.
Because they do.
Well, I was in Jordan, and a guy told me a joke. He said, and this was a while ago, so it's before the current really terrible things started happening in Syria, but he said there was an American journalist and a Syrian journalist in a bar. And the American journalist said to the Syrian journalist, we have freedom of speech in my country. I can say that George Bush isn't very smart in my newspaper. And then the Syrian journalist said, we have freedom of speech in my country too. I can say George Bush isn't very smart in my newspaper. So these are I mean, I agree with what you're saying. You know, these things are ingrained, and the content stuff is cultural as much as it is, you know, product of law. So in that sense, it's very much, even though the regimes are authoritarian, I mean, the law is in a sense democratic because it's expressing sensitivities that are held by the public. Mm-hmm.
So does the media law in Rwanda have an impact on the bad things that go on in Rwanda? Is that important in some other sense besides just the media?
Well, it is interesting because in that particular case, you have a president, by now a well-entrenched president, who is a member of the minority, because President Kagame is a Tutsi. So it is in his interest for people to think of themselves not in terms of, you know, I don't mean tribes at all in a disparaging way, but not think of themselves in terms of tribes because he is a member of the minority tribe. So to the extent if people in Rwanda start talking about Hutus and Tutsis, that works against his political interest. But you saw in Rwanda there has been and continues to be very aggressive punishment of political opposition and this charge of divisionism, which basically means it's a crime to separate people among Hutus and Tutsis. I mean, that's used constantly against people who are running against the president and genocide deniers, and if anyone makes any comments that's contrary to the history in the media or in speech. So it's you know, law at the end of the day is just law. And if you don't have a robust judiciary that's interested in protecting people who have minority views, I mean, it's in a sense academic, unfortunately.
So my students are often interested in international issues that have to do with cyber law, and find them often hard to get their arms around in terms of how to actually do research projects. First of all, because they're in Carroll Hall and they're not in Africa.
Right.
Someplace else where they don't speak any other language besides English.
Right.
So how do you deal with all of that? What kind of advice do you have for young scholars who are interested in some of these international issues and their sources of grant funding that you're familiar with, or
right.
You know, where are the opportunities to do that?
Yeah, I mean, most of my work has been on the legal side, more so than the legal reform side rather than the research side. But it's just like anything else. If you have an interesting experience, you're a real mercenary in figuring out how to write about it. But you know, some schools have centers for communication studies. Penn has one. That's the folks that I work with the most. And it's like on the international law side, in terms of like the Article 19 is a really robust organization that does a lot of analysis of domestic laws in the context of international law. The thing about international law is that international freedom of expression law generally protects the right to receive information as well as, you know, to speak. And that's whether or not that's an academic difference or not. It does tend to argue in favor of a two-way communication model. So in other words, you have the right to receive a tweet the same way you would have the right to send it. So conceptually, I think there are some things that we could argue about in terms of international law that might take better account of some of these communications technology issues than domestic law. But in terms of like international law procedure, that requires a high degree of specialty. You know, I don't know that a graduate student would even be interested in that, because you have to, I'm pretty sure to bring you have to exhaust your domestic remedies. So basically you have to sue in your own country and lose under whatever regime your own country has to protect speech. But I mean, I think there's an opportunity to kind of look at laws, look at international best practices, and compare and that's more kind of desk research, I guess. But I think there's opportunities for that as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
It's great to be here.